Chamberlain Scott was late again. The halls of Temerton's finest research institution, Valley Peterson, were abustle with students dashing to their next classes. It was Chamberlain's first year at the prestigious school, and he was late dropping her off. He was responsible for her while his father was away, and the timing couldn't have been any worse. Chamberlain begged his father not to leave, but Greg Scott was a stubborn man. As the district leader of Sorgan, he was ambitious, sure, but easily distracted. He left Chamberlain in charge of Chamberlain without regard for his oldest son, for the boy's arduous class load, or for his commitment to the highest ranking and most coveted science team at Valley Peterson, Team Orion. Now, Chamberlain was late again, and he had no excuse. The sight of him running through the institution's main courtyard caught the attention of students from every corner. The school was demanding, an ambitious schedule often leaving students scrambling between classes, and Chamberlain was no exception. As he ran, his fellow students opened the way, an audience drawn all the way from the courtyard to the bridges between the buildings, as he dashed up the stairs to the science wing. Throwing the doors open, he moved swiftly through its halls. Finally, he reached the stairs leading to his floor and paced himself with each step, being careful not to drop the books loosening in his grip. 5 floors up, he turned more corners, disappearing through the halls until stopping at a door near the end of the corridor. "Please be late, Professor Weston," Chamberlain pleaded. "Please be late." He opened the door and peered inside. The professor stood front and center of the lab, discussing something with the rest of the team. They were far enough inside not to notice the door opening, and they were focused on something else, something above them on the ceiling. Chamberlain saw his chance and began to move inside, when one of his colleagues, Urian Tathers, glanced down at the door. Chamberlain froze as the boy muttered something to the professor and made his way across the room. He backed away as Urian exited out into the hall. "You're late, Chamberlain," Urian said impatiently. "Again." "I know, Urian, I'm sorry," Chamberlain replied hastily. He held up his notebook. "I'm here now, I have everything prepared." Urian's expression didn't change as he gazed down at it. He crossed his arms and took a small breath. "Do you have the calculations for dynamic motion?" "Yes," Chamberlain hesitated, placing a few of the books under his arm to flip through the pages. "Do you have the ranges for the sensor scaling, the propulsion force measurements for projected movement, the timing for the chemical dispersion rates?" Chamberlain clambered through the pages as he looked, but eventually he stopped with a small sigh. "Listen, it was a rough night. I didn't have time to finish everything. I was planning to come in early and finish up, but..." "Chamberlain, just stop," Urian said with a steady voice. His eyes softened as he watched the dismay hit the boy's face, and he placed a hand on his shoulder. "I can see you're under a lot of stress. Have you considered that maybe you're overburdened? I told you last time that I was concerned about your contributions to the team of late, but it's only gotten worse. Chamberlain, if you can't do this, then..." "I can handle it, Urian," Chamberlain demanded. "Look, the CSC reviews are just around the corner. I knew that I wouldn't be able to count on you today, so I asked Kelly to complete the calculations on your behalf." "What?" Chamberlain said, gazing back towards the open doorway. "Urian, why would you..." "If I hadn't asked her, we would not have a viable prototype to showcase to Professor Weston," Chamberlain, Urian seethed. "Tefos is working, no thanks to you. It's not fair to the rest of the team, who has to make up for your slack." Urian glanced back as they heard excited yelling from one in the lab. He crossed his arms, turning patiently back to Chamberlain. "When you campaigned for Yurk to join Team Orion last year, I was adamantly opposed to it. Still am. He's an orphan, hasn't earned his place at Valley Peterson, much less Team Orion. Yet somehow, he has still managed to outshine you in the 6 months that he's been here. He redesigned the entire project in just a few days. Chamberlain, I'm starting to think that you inadvertently hired your own replacement." "Urian, Project Tefos was my idea," Chamberlain urged, glaring into the boy's soft, dispassionate stare. "You can't kick me off the team." "And I'm not going to," Urian replied calmly. "You're gonna quit on your own, quietly." Chamberlain's shoulders fell as he realized that Urian was serious, and the boy continued. "You can't keep using your sister as an excuse. Eventually, you need to step up. There are others who would take twice the class load, twice the responsibility, and still jump to have your position." He shook his head as if to steady his own impatience. "I want you to submit your resignation to Professor Weston, citing whatever excuse you can come up with, so that you can open the spot for someone who can actually contribute to the team. You know, someone who isn't just the comedy relief." Chamberlain's eyes burned as Urian turned quietly back to the lab, letting the door close behind him. It shut with a soft, echoing click, leaving the boy there alone in the hall. He waited a moment, his eyes closed, before bending down to pick up his things, packing his books back into the bag before turning to leave. He took a few steps when he heard the door to the lab open again. I'm going, Urian, Chamberlain said without turning, his voice shaking in measured rage. No need to kick a dead horse. Chamberlain? Urian said you were out sick today. I thought you weren't coming in. A softer, female voice came. Chamberlain turned to see that it belonged to Kalani Nialani, a girl with tan skin and dark, curly hair. Are you coming inside? The presentation started already. I don't think... Chamberlain started lowly. We could still use you, Kalani interrupted, holding out her hand. She gave him a knowing look and he sighed, shaking his head. He finished tucking the papers back into his book and hiked the bag up across his shoulder. I'm serious, Kalani. I probably shouldn't go in there, Chamberlain said, Urian's words just at the edge of his lips. Kalani stopped inside, seeing the soft concern behind the boy's eyes. It's not Team Orion without you, Kalani said, taking a step closer. You know that we don't stand a chance if we don't have full commitment from everyone on the team, especially you. This was your dream. Right, but... No buts, Kalani smiled, brushing his shoulder. Come on, Yurik and the others are waiting for us. Yurik, Chamberlain repeated, his eyes clipping momentarily to the door lab. He saw that Yurik was holding the remote to Tefos, leading the presentation, and Urian's words ran through his mind again. Maybe his best friend would become his replacement after all. His eyes moved back to Kalani's as he gave a short, dishonest smile. Kalani took his hand and the two entered the lab. As they moved towards the center to join the group, Kalani retook her place next to Yurik, who was still gazing up at the ceiling. He was working the controls of the remote clutched between his hands. Chamberlain stopped just outside of the group, his eyes resting on Kalani before nervously they moved to the others. Urian shook his head softly as their eyes locked. Glad you could join us, Chamberlain, Professor Weston said brightly. I have to say, Team Orion, your progress with Tefos has been remarkable. I honestly didn't expect this stage so soon. As he took off his jacket, Chamberlain followed everyone's gaze to the ceiling. Tefos was crawling upside down, clinging to one of the metal support beams of the lab. It was their latest robot, TPH 4.0, a spider-like robot of an industrial design. It was small enough to be held with two hands, and light enough to cling to the walls and ceilings using the adhesive solution that Kalani had devised. Chamberlain stared, just as shocked as the professor to see Tefos performing so well. The last time he had seen it, it was barely operational, and there was a week's worth of effort remaining to get it to a working state. I take it the calculations were yours, Chamberlain? Professor Weston asked, his smile beaming as he watched the robot crawl. Well, actually, they were Kalani's, Urian interjected. Kalani glanced at Urian and then at Chamberlain. The tension was palpable between them, and she could sense it. With a measured tone, she added, Actually, yes, Professor. Chamberlain sent me his calculations last night. Urian's expression changed quickly as he glanced between the two of them. He was going to say something, but given that Professor Weston was in attendance, he remained quiet. Chamberlain mouthed the words thank you to Kalani, who replied with a soft smile. Professor Weston nodded. In any case, the movements are impressive, especially with the team's dramatic departure from the previous model. I must admit I was a bit nervous when you decided to move on from the polymeric suction pads, but it seems to have paid off. There is just one issue. He pointed to the window. The team looked and noticed what he meant. There were clear marks left on the glass from the chemicals dispensed at the end of Tefos' legs. Just then, Tefos fell from the ceiling. Professor Weston and the others jumped as Yurik caught it with his free hand, and they realized that he had let it drop intentionally. As the team gathered around in stilled relief, he turned it over so that they could see the underside of the machine. The marks on the glass are just made up of soap, Professor. Here, Yurik pointed. At the end, there's a compression pad with a chamber for the degradable adhesive. The chemicals are dispensed from different source chambers, pressurized inside of the legs, and the compression pads react with the compound to create an adhesive layer. When the chamber reacts and exposes the agent to light, the reaction is immediate, and it decomposes into a base material. Remarkable, Professor Weston replied, curiously inspecting the craftsmanship of the chemical dispensers. One of my main concerns was that a chemical solution would require a massive investment in time and research, especially for precise movement. These dispensers... Chamberlain studied them as well. They were a new design, fabricated with an intricate interplay of robotics and chemical engineering, tubes running through like veins, the dispensers reactive to the pressure of the solution as it flowed. As he inspected it, he couldn't help but feel that Yurik had surpassed all the expectations of the team. His ability at engineering merged biological anatomy with electrical circuitry, requiring a sophisticated understanding of a level of biomechanics that had barely been invented. He wondered if he would even be able to understand it, much less come up with something similar. The movement is still constrained, Urian's voice broke Chamberlain from his stance. While Yurik's engineering did help integrate Kalani's new chemical, I don't think we should have moved to the newer model so soon. Well, you're the team captain, Urian, Weston said in passing. We were outvoted, Dale said begrudgingly on the side. Dale agrees with me. Iterating on the speed of the design will be nearly impossible in just a few weeks, Urian continued, his arms crossed. Unless we have double commitment from the entire team, I don't think we should stick with this design. Professor Weston gazed at Urian a moment before turning to Chamberlain, along with the rest of the team. The boy's face turned red under the sudden attention. I agree, Chamberlain said. Urian gave him an exasperated look, and Chamberlain shrugged. I think we should do it. I don't mind the extra commitment, he lied. Urian and Dale rolled their eyes, and Professor Weston then turned his gaze. How about you, Yurik? Are you willing to invest the extra commitment? You have shown such dedication to this project already, despite your short time on the team. Yurik gazed up from his pad. Well, Professor, I don't think we need a new design, he said, his eyes falling pensively down to the remote in his hands. We can use Timmerden's new artificial intelligence, K0. We can serve a small instance of the model and program it to optimize Tefos' movements based on the strength of the adhesive, which will save us time on an entirely new redesign. Tefos turned itself around and crawled onto Yurik's head as Professor Weston studied him. You're saying that you want to integrate K0 into Tefos' operating system, is that right, Yurik? Weston asked with a testy tone. That's right, Yurik replied briskly. It's the first artificial intelligence classified as neurogenerative. If it truly is what Timmerden claims, then it could be the final puzzle piece to unlocking Tefos' full potential. That's ridiculous, Urian huffed, unable to control his reaction. Professor Weston gave him a side look, and Urian fought to regain control of himself. We don't have enough time as it is. Why would we add an entirely new feature that we don't even know will work? There are countless policies that we would need to integrate, protocols that we would have to handle. His voice was a mix of placating pleasantry and unfettered emotion. It would save us time if we used it to optimize the rate-resistance ratio for every movement, and regenerate the dispersion rate for the adhesive, Yurik replied, quietly fiddling with the nozzles of the remote switch. Professor Weston pondered a moment. Well, Yurik, while it is an interesting idea, I don't think we're at this stage now where we could risk that kind of integration. There's no telling how long it would take, and I'm not sure it would even be possible to. I've already done it, Professor, Yurik said, taking a breath and looking up from the remote. The room fell quiet as everyone stared. After a moment, Professor Weston smiled, with a short, humorous laugh escaping him. Oh, it's a joke, I see. Urian glared at Yurik from the side of his eye, prompting a soft glance from the boy. Yurik set down the remote and held out his arm. I'll show you. A moment passed, and then another, and finally Tefos reacted. Chamberlain and the others watched in disbelief as the robot whirred to life from the top of Yurik's head and began crawling down his back, along his shoulder, bridging his arm. It crawled until it hung upside down from the palm of his hand. Yurik, how on Yllisius? Chamberlain started, watching the robot's live, dynamic reactions. When did you have time? I just installed it last night, Yurik said quietly. By Ilias founder Nomen, Yurik, Professor Weston said, looking closely at the machine. You must have had to rewire the entire operating system. Professor, Urian said, his eyes red hot with anger, I did not approve of this. This was irresponsible and dangerous. There are hundreds of protocols that we don't know about, integration points to be considered. We don't have time to fully test. You're right, Urian, Professor Weston said, inspecting the machine closely. It reacted in real time, meeting his steady gaze with its own optical scanners, emotively expressing his curiosity, as if breathing, as if alive. Closing his eyes, he shook himself out of his trance. You're absolutely right. Integrating K0 would have been inadvisable at this stage. But if what Yurik says is true, it could be the exact type of risk that sets Team Orion apart at the CSC reviews. In fact, an integration like this, imagine it. Cities built in no time flat? The applications for Tefos are limitless. Professor, Urian nearly shouted. Professor Weston held out a hand to stop him. Urian, while your steadfast commitment to convention has led this team to victory in the past, it is tenacity like this that will continue to push science ahead. In fact, if this is the new direction for Tefos, then I think it makes sense if Yurik leads the way. What do you all think? Chamberlain was first to raise his hand, his eyes meeting Urian's as he glared. He was followed shortly by Kalini and then Professor Weston himself. My vote counts too, you know, Professor Weston said with a short smile. That is, of course, if Yurik accepts. Yurik gazed at Weston a while, unsure of what to say. Instinctively, he thought of his best friend and the two locked eyes. As they met, Chamberlain couldn't hold back his excitement. It turned out that Yllisius wouldn't be replacing him after all, he'd be replacing Orion. The realization hitting him, he turned to see the fury on Orion's face and relished in it. Yllisius shared in Chamberlain's infectious smile and sighed, looking back at the professor. "I accept," he said, finally. Orion shook his head, looking away, and Dale crossed his arms. "That settles it then," Professor Weston said. "At least for the time being, Team Orion will be led by Yllisius Vayor to see the newest version of Tefos through to completion. Now, while today was a real treat, I have to be heading off." He checked his watch. "I need to prepare for my next lecture. You will probably want to formalize the details of Yllisius' new role on the team." He stole one last glance at Tefos, which had found a comfortable position onto Yllisius' shoulder, and quietly shook his head. He turned to leave but stopped, swerving on his heel. "Oh, and one more thing. I will be returning for another evaluation before the week of the CSC reviews. I expect to see great things. Don't let me down, Team Orion." And he was gone. A few hours passed, and Chamberlain had settled at his desk with his books and supplies. His previous fear of being kicked off the team had been replaced with elation that his best friend had made the team captain. Still, Orion's words had affected him, maybe more than he cared to admit at the time. As he sat there, his smile still bright from the moment he watched Orion and Dale storm out of the lab together, a sour thought hit him. One thing about Orion was that he wasn't exactly mean, he was honest. As he stared at his half-finished equations and incomplete notes, he wondered how much of what Orion said was his emotion, and how much of it was truth. Did he really belong on Team Orion? He started turning through the pages, attempting to estimate the volume of his contributions to the team, when he heard a mechanical whirring to the side of him. He glanced over and saw Tefos, his scanners emotively analyzing him and his notes. Chamberlain smiled and sat back, staring as the robot crawled over his notepads and papers like a cat looking for a soft place. He picked it up, studying its new design. "I still can't believe you did this, Yllisius," Chamberlain said, throwing the robot up a small ways and catching it again. "It's so reactive. How high can I throw it?" He wound his arm back when Yllisius walked up beside him, his hand outreached. "That's our only prototype, Chamberlain. If we break it, I'll have to make it all over again." "Right," Chamberlain said with a slight pause. Yllisius took the machine and started back to his desk, quietly inspecting it. "Guys, I feel kind of bad about replacing Orion like that," Kelani said from her desk, gazing up at the two of them. "It's fine," Chamberlain replied quickly. "He's fine. I mean, we all know how competitive Valley Peterson is. Team leads get replaced all the time. It's a wonder he wasn't replaced already." He said that last part mostly to himself. "Orion was a good leader," Yllisius stated. "I never wanted to replace him, but I think that using K0 is the best way forward if we don't want to go to the previous version. He was right about the chemical adhesive. We wouldn't be able to iterate on the next design before the review without K0. Even with the new operating system, we still have a lot of work to do before Tefos is ready for the next presentation." "Well, while I do feel bad for Orion, I'm still proud of you, Yllisius," Kelani said. "I think you're going to make a great team leader." The two locked eyes for a moment. Yllisius' face went red as she smiled at him, and he turned away, pretending to look through the notes on his table. Kelani laughed to herself as she watched him, and Chamberlain shook his head. "Well, wish I could stay to get caught up, but it's getting late. I'll need to pick up my sister from her classes and take her home, since Greg isn't around to do it," Chamberlain sighed. "I should probably head home too," Kelani said, standing to pack her things. "My little sister will kill me if I stay over past her bedtime 2 nights in a row." She quickly wore her backpack and turned towards the exit of the lab, stomping at Chamberlain. "Sorry I can't turn on you, but chin up, Chamberlain. And don't worry, we got your back, right, Yllisius?" Kelani said. The two waited, but Yllisius seemed absorbed in a note he had found. Kelani shot an empathetic gaze at Chamberlain before patting him and heading out for the night. When the door to the lab closed, he began to gather his things as well. "So, you sleeping in the lab again tonight?" "Probably," Yllisius said, leaning back in his chair. "You know, you could always stay at my house. We could use the company," Chamberlain said weakly. Yllisius gave a soft smile but didn't respond. Finally, as Chamberlain packed the last of his supplies, he took a breath. "There was something I wanted to ask you. Do you mind walking with me?" Chamberlain led the way until they were outside of the lab, and he shut the door behind them. "Thanks for joining me, Yllisius. You have no idea what I've been through the past few days. You becoming the team lead is the best news all week. Chamberlain stood back a moment to lock the door. As he did, Yllisius began walking ahead when another student brushed past him, nearly toppling the both of them. He dropped the notebook he was holding and stood there, glaring at the boy who had crashed into him. The boy was wearing a hoodie, covering his face and hair, and his eyes darkly crossed over them. He turned to continue walking. Yllisius knelt carefully to retrieve his notebook, still glaring up at the boy, his eyes acutely trained. "Guess they teach everything but manners at Valley Peterson, am I right?" Chamberlain said, looking curiously between Yllisius and the boy disappearing down the hall. Yllisius took a breath and gazed down at his notebook, his eyes running along its pages. He started to walk ahead again, his fingers clutching the book tighter than before. "Yeah, so I was gonna tell you," Chamberlain uttered, giving him an odd look. "Orion was gonna kick me off the team. Did he mention it to you?" "No, not really," Yllisius muttered quietly. Chamberlain glanced at him, then looked ahead as they turned a corner of the hall, heading for the stairway. They walked a few more steps before Chamberlain rushed down and stepped in front of Yllisius, halting him in place. "Is everything alright? You seem a bit spaced out." "Huh? Oh, yeah, I'm just finishing something," Yllisius said plainly. "Uh-huh," Chamberlain replied as Yllisius stepped to the side of him. Chamberlain paused as his mind reeled at his friend's odd behavior. He rushed to catch up with Yllisius as they came to the bottom of the stairwell, and the two walked for a while longer. "Look, I'm sorry I didn't finish the calculations in time for Professor Weston's review," Chamberlain said finally. "I hope you're not upset about that. Now that you're the team lead, I'm going to prove myself useful, that I'm not just the comedy relief. I'm not going to slack off like before. I promise, okay?" Yllisius took a few more steps and stopped, turning his attention to Chamberlain, who stepped aside nervously. The two stared at each other as a couple of other Valley Peterson lab techs passed by, Chamberlain's eyes burning as Yllisius gazed intently at him. After a tense moment passed, Yllisius shook his head. "Wait a minute, did you say that Orion was going to kick you off the team?" Chamberlain stared a moment longer, relief settling over him as he realized that Yllisius had not been listening at all. The fear in his chest cooled down, and with a small breath he closed his eyes, shaking his head. Never mind, it's not important." "Good," Yllisius said, returning his eyes to the notebook. Chamberlain inhaled lightly, eager to change the subject. "So, leader of Team Orion, can you believe it? What are you going to do with all that power?" He glanced over at the notebook in Yllisius' hands. It wasn't one from the lab. It was old and leather-bound, looked to be a personal diary of some sort. "I have a few ideas," Yllisius said passively. Chamberlain gave a cool sigh. "Well, the K0 idea was a big one. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad you did it. But what made you go and install something like that into Tefos without Orion's permission anyway?" Yllisius stopped, suddenly noticing Chamberlain staring at his notebook, and with a suspicious eye, he pocketed it. I made a backup of the operating system, so there was no real risk. When I saw that it worked on my simulations, I just did the installation. Other than some rewiring and reprinting of the components, the integration went smoothly." "Right, I understand. I guess what I'm saying is, I didn't realize that they allowed private installations of government property." Yllisius stopped, giving him an odd look before walking briskly ahead. As Chamberlain watched him, he realized how accusatory his statement sounded, and silently he regretted saying it. As the two continued on, they rounded a corner to the courtyard that hung between a few of the major science halls of the vast institution of Valley Peterson. The courtyard was wide and spacious, spiraling sleek columns and twisted into other entries and stairwells, all surrounding a central outdoor garden, fitted with yellow and purple trees and ponds flush with life. As they crossed towards the building holding his sister Kimberly's last class, they could see a huddle of students on the side, arguing about something. Chamberlain got a sinking feeling in his stomach as he gazed at the crowd. "You see that? I think those kids are from Kim's class," Chamberlain said. Yllisius gazed up at the commotion. Chamberlain squinted as he studied them. He realized that there were 4 people, 3 older boys and 2 girls, all surrounding a single person. "Wait a minute, that's Kim!" Chamberlain yelled. He rushed forward just as the group began to devolve into an all-out shoving match, as the girl in the center began to scream and thrash against the 2 girls grabbing her. As he closed in, one of the girls slapped his sister hard against the face and she fell, holding her eye. The girl tried to get down on top of her, but Chamberlain rammed her out of the way, sending her sprawling back. He hovered over his sister. "Are you okay? What's going on?" She was bleeding over her eye, wincing as he touched it, and his blood began to boil. He turned and stood, ready to demand an answer, when his vision went white. A ringing filled his ears and he could feel himself falling backwards on the ground, a searing pain shooting across his face. "Don't touch my sister," a voice came. Realizing he had been punched by one of the older guys there, Chamberlain gazed up at his attacker. It was a student his age with blonde hair and wild eyes, staring down at him. After a moment, he recognized him. It was an EV of the school, Terry Merlin. Chamberlain dragged himself backwards as Terry approached. "Hey!" Yllisius called. Chamberlain turned to see his friend standing a short ways away, glaring at the boys standing over Chamberlain and Kim. They each exchanged a short glance before laughing. "Just walk away, mute boy," Terry said with a grin, "before I make sure you live up to the name." Chamberlain glanced at Terry again, unsure of what was happening. As he watched him, he noticed something familiar. He was wearing the same jersey as the boy that had bumped Yllisius in the hall. He glanced back at Yllisius, a question at the edge of his lips, but he was too late to wonder. Without hesitation, Yllisius started rushing forward. "Yllisius, stop!" Chamberlain called, but it was too late. One of Terry's boys came in from the side, ramming his arm harshly into Yllisius' neck as he passed him. In one smooth motion, Yllisius was on the ground, clutching his throat, and the boys were laughing again. "Chamberlain, listen to me. You need to run and go get..." Chamberlain started, but Chamberlain tapped him frantically. "Chamberlain!" He looked again, and Terry's friend had pressed his knee into Yllisius' chest as he pummeled him relentlessly. Yllisius couldn't do much more than block the blows as the other boy laughed. That's when Terry turned back to Chamberlain, his teeth grinding in a fit of rage that didn't seem to dissipate. He bent down and grabbed Chamberlain by his collar, smiling slyly at his sister as he did. "Let him go!" Chamberlain yelled. "Kim, just run!" Chamberlain urged. Terry spit on his face and paused, admiring his work, before smearing it all over him. "Yeah, Kim, run," Terry mocked. He slapped Chamberlain playfully, then started to pull him to his feet. When he froze, "Terry!" a boy's voice came. He sighed and released Chamberlain's cuff, turning around. "What is it? Can't you see that I'm..." He stopped cold. What he saw put a lump in his throat too big for him to pass, and he stood up finally, staring at the scene before him. What the Only a few moments had passed, but the scene was gruesome. Yllisius was off the ground, standing over one of his friends, who had fallen over, clutching his mouth. There was blood in the boy's hands, a lot of it, and a rock in Yllisius' fist. Yllisius gazed over, a look to his eye that sent a chill through the air. Chamberlain looked in stunned silence. "You freak, what are you doing?" Terry started, but his moment was short-lived. Yllisius hurled the rock without hesitating. The rock zeroed in on Terry like a homing missile, and a crack rang through the evening air. In a short second, Yllisius had run across the field and closed the distance. Terry yelled out, throwing feral punches. He nailed Yllisius once, twice, but the boy wouldn't stop. They exchanged blow after blow until Yllisius tackled Terry to the ground. He suffered one punch to the side, Terry's elbow flailing wildly towards Yllisius' face, but soon Yllisius was fully on top of him. The scene went from an after-school brawl to a gruesome beating in a matter of moments. As Yllisius punched wildly, his yells filling the air of the garden, Terry's body went limp. His friends watched in fear as Yllisius threw his fist down so hard they came up wet with blood. "Yllisius," Chamberlain huffed, watching. The boy didn't stop. Terry was motionless as Yllisius rammed his fists into the EV, the impact so loud it smacked and echoed throughout the courtyard. He covered Terry in blows until the boy's blood stained the grass in heaps. The two others backed away from the scene. The girls had long run away, and Chamberlain watched as Yllisius went on and on and on. "Yllisius, stop!" Chamberlain yelled finally, his voice echoing loudly. Yllisius froze, still staring down, barely there. He let his hand fall into the grass, gazing down at it, saw it dripping in blood, and then he looked down at the bloody mess he had created. He huffed to catch his breath, and turned his attention to the onlookers, who all stood back in stunned silence. "What have you done?" Chamberlain breathed, watching the boy rise in the middle of the field. Kim looked away, sobbing into the side of her brother's shirt. Closing his eyes with a gentle breath, Yllisius brushed the dirt from his pants. Then, without a word, he turned and walked the road back through the courtyard, following the pathway, until he was gone.